For those of you who didn't hear or didn't know in the last session, my name is Katie Barr. I don't know if I held the mic up to my face high enough for you to hear. I'm a local food researcher, local food advocate. I work currently for the Common Market, which is a nonprofit regional food distributor that connects a network of local family farms directly to institutions. But I'm here to present to you in this session the research that I did on farm stops as a general model for my master's work here at the University of Michigan. So, and then after that, Matt Mariola of Wooster College is going to be presenting some data that he presented on local routes over 10 years to understand the financial impacts of the model. So essentially, I'm going to provide you a quick overview of the project that I designed. I will tell you a little bit about the distinction between a farm stop. I know we've kind of gotten into this a little bit, but the question that I often get is, what is the difference between a farm stop, a farmer's market, a food co-op, a food hub? They can often, have a lot of similarities. So I wanted to kind of break down some of those differences there and offer how farm stops fit into the mix. I'll go over some of the methodology of my study, although I won't bore you too much with any stats or anything, and the initial results. And then, of course, we'll get into some major themes and overall recommendations of what I found. Awesome. So before I begin, I want to thank some key partners here, all of the farm stops that participated in my research, and I want to provide a quick caveat here as well. I did this research 2 years ago, so a lot has changed in that time. A lot more farm stops have grown and developed, so what I present to you today hopefully will just be a starting point for more research that could be added to the playing field. But I do want to thank these partners for their contributions to the study in general. Oh, awesome. All right, so what was my project? What did I want to do? So we've talked a lot today about the ways that farm stops do impact a local and regional food system financially. We understand that, of course, Argus, with their model, they've given over $2 million back to the local food economy, which is fantastic. When I started this, so part of what I neglected to mention as my background, I'm also an organic farmer. And the first time that I ever walked into Argus, I was like, why is no one else doing this? The idea of consignment and giving the farmer themselves 70% of the retail price, giving them back that money, was mind-blowing to me. I mean, that was something that was clearly not available to myself as a farmer. And so I wanted to understand how these models are building a resilient regional food system, and specifically how communities are interacting with them. So we've seen, again, the financial side, how they've impacted a food economy. We've seen and heard from some farmers today about and we'll hear from more farmers about how they are interacting with this model. But I really wanted to understand what communities were doing, what sort of values this model was imparting to the communities that they existed in. And so I kind of bit off more than I could chew in the start. I designed a 3-part project, the first 2 of which I'm going to present to you today, the third of which is actually still a work in progress. I have my degree, I graduated, I finished all my master's stuff, but I have over 40 farmer interviews that I'm now sifting through to understand the farmer side of how farm stops are impacting the farmers that they work with. So first, I'm going to talk about a survey that I designed to understand, again, that cultural impact that farm stops have, what they are imparting to the communities they work with. And then I'm going to talk about a guidebook that I actually wrote in conjunction with the farm stops that participated, so that the model could be replicated in as many other locales as possible for whoever is interested. So before I do that, I do want to dive into, again, the differences between farm stops and other local food distribution models. And for that, I want to keep in mind the definition of civic agriculture by Thomas Lyson. Essentially, this helps us to understand that a resilient food system revolves around the emergence and the growth of these community-based food production activities that also support the communities themselves by providing entrepreneurship, jobs, and just strengthening community identity as a whole. This was the definition that I tried to keep in mind as I tried to understand, again, what the impact of this model is on the communities they serve. But to quickly kind of break down, we know what a farmer's market is. I'm sure everyone here has been to one, has operated one, has participated in one. So I won't go over that. A food co-op we know as primarily a business entity, a way of organizing a particular place where producers, workers, community members can participate in decision-making processes or just participate on a deeper level with the model itself. And then food hub is kind of a new term that's come up. The Common Market is a food hub. They're essentially just aggregators that work with a whole number of producers and then distribute to a number of different distribution channels. So they can operate on retail, wholesale, and I'll also note that food co-ops, food hubs, they can also offer entrepreneurial services as well and be able to reach their consumers on a different level. So where do farm stops fall there? There we go. I tried to draw a very rudimentary little design here. Forgive me, my drawing skills are not that great. But essentially what I wanted to highlight here is that farm stops kind of fall smack dab in the center of some of these models. So with a co-op, we know again that it's a legal business entity that others can participate in depending on how it's organized. We know that farmers markets are these year-round markets that farmers are directly participating in, direct-to-consumer sales. We know that food hubs, they focus on a variety of different purchasing methods, and they're aggregating local producers and offering entrepreneurial services, but they all are essentially mission-driven local food distribution models. The only places that they really differ is this, retail, wholesale, direct-to-consumer line. Of course, there's probably more nuance to that, but farm stops themselves can act essentially as all three. I mean, we've heard today that a farm stop can be incorporated as a co-op, whether it's worker-owned, producer-owned, consumer-owned, or a combination thereof. They also are aggregators. So most of the farm stops that I've presented today, or many of them at least, are working with a number of producers, sometimes more than 200, 300 producers at a time to aggregate their product into one space and offer direct-to-consumer sales or other retail options. So they are also year-round farmers markets. So they occupy this really interesting space where they kind of offer a combination of each of these different models. And I want to highlight that this is not to say that farm stops are meant to push out any one of these models. They're meant to work in collaboration with, and that's something that's really exciting. That malleability that they have is something I'm going to touch on as a really important way to enhance the resilience of a community. So what did I do? What kind of survey did I design? I essentially took 4 farm stops that I had been working with. I worked with 6 in total for the entirety of the project in developing the guidebook, but for the sake of the survey, I worked with these 4 here. And I chose these 4 primarily because they were oldest in operation, except for the Wild Ramp. They were unable to participate in the survey, unfortunately. But they also represent a number of different business structures and business entities. Some are nonprofits, some are co-ops, worker-owned or member-owned, some are, of course, Argus is a L3C, and then also they represent a diversity of different geographic areas too. So wanted to get a broad spectrum of, not just understanding one farm stop operating in one kind of location, but just across the board how they operated. So the kind of questions that I asked, I basically lumped them into 4 categories or 4 sections. So of course I asked about food purchasing behaviors. So how are these farm stops influencing people's perception or their purchasing habits? I asked about their community values. So how are farm stops adding additional value to the community beyond just food purchasing? And then I asked about accessibility. So not just whether or not these stores are available and open year round, but also if they are enhancing long-term resilience and enhancing food access overall. And then, of course, I did ask some questions on demographics. Those smaller little sections there, that's the themes that evolved and the categories that evolved in the evaluation process, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. So in terms of the kinds of questions that I asked, I essentially created a bunch of matrices. Again, I'm not going to bore you with what this looks like, but I asked people on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not important at all, 5 being incredibly important, how important it was that a farm stop offered this to their community. So how important was it that a farm stop meets the majority of their household food needs for a week, that they prioritize seasonal products, that they deliver a unique shopping experience, that they support other small businesses or make an effort to engage with their community. I then asked some other questions just about community values. So how are these farm stops, how did people feel that farm stops were helping to grow a local food economy? How did they feel the consignment model would enhance community resilience? And my favorite 2 questions, if the store went out of business, how would it affect their daily life? And then how would it affect their community? And the initial results were pretty incredibly supportive of the model. And keep in mind, this was a fairly small sample size. Again, I want to reiterate that this is preliminary research. Hopefully this inspires additional research in the future. But what I found was through that economics theme, 82% of people were at least very or somewhat willing to pay more for groceries from a farm stop model. And I'll get into why in just a second. In the community theme, 90% of people felt that farm stops do have a strong presence in the community and that they also enjoyed spending time at a farm stop. And then within the advocacy piece, and this was by far one of the most important things that I found, people felt that they personally are helping to grow a local food economy by participating in a farm stop. And I'll get into why that was so important. Lastly, in terms of resilience, 92% of people felt that farm stops do increase the long-term resilience of neighborhoods to crisis events, pandemics, economic downturns. So, talking about the major themes, in the economics theme, why was it so important, or why were people more willing to pay a little bit more for their groceries at a place like a farm stop? Essentially what it came down to is the fact that a farm stop doesn't just offer a wide variety of products. They're a one-stop shop where people can go to get the majority of their household needs. Maybe not all, but a good majority of them. But they also are incredibly vocal and incredibly passionate about supporting local farmers and producers. That much is evident. That's why we're all here today. And that it was incredibly important to consumers that they do so. So essentially, these stores represent an opportunity for people to align with the values of a farm stop, and it shifts their priorities in terms of their purchasing behaviors. So people are more willing to go out of their way maybe, or to prioritize purchasing local products because they align with the values that farm stops are imparting to the community. This also speaks to something called the multiplier effect, something that many of you might be familiar with, which is essentially just keeping local dollars circulating as fast as you can within a local radius. So the fact that people are more willing, or somewhat at least willing, to pay more for groceries at a farm stop or to continue to shop at a farm stop indicates that that local dollar is going to continue recirculating in that area. So again, I drew a little rudimentary graph for you here, but essentially, a farm stop is going to source local product, the consumer is going to purchase from that farm stop. The farm stop is then going to use the rest of that money that doesn't go to the farmer to hire staff and to hire others within the community to support the operations of that store. They're then going to be able to use that money to collaborate with other local businesses, whether to allow them to sell at a farm stop or to maybe put together local events or other activities that then further build social capital. So it continues to build. And the reason this is so important is that this is essentially what enhances and strengthens the financial resilience of a local community to those crisis events that we've experienced through the pandemic, through other economic downturns. So the more money you can keep circulating and the faster, the better. And so that, again, speaks to the resilience piece here, that through other avenues, or rather the reason that 92% of people felt that farm stops do enhance the long-term resilience here is through a couple of different ways. So first of all, the diversified revenue streams that farm stops create. We know through the consignment model that 20 to 30% consignment piece, farm stops or most businesses could not be able to survive on that alone. So essentially they're forced to branch out and broaden their scope into a number of different streams that further support farmers and provide additional outlets for them to sell their goods, but also continue to support the community. So that builds out a level of flexibility and malleability to allow the farm stop to operate in a number of different scenarios. And then, of course, they provide this engaging atmosphere. This was something that, it was an interesting finding that because, again, kind of goes back to that initial finding of people are more willing to shop at a farm stop, they felt that farm stops offer something very unique that they want to continue to participate in. They enjoy spending time there. They enjoy wanting to be a part of a community. So it essentially creates what's known as a sense of place, which I've heard mentioned here a couple of times in other sessions, is something that we are very quickly losing in a lot of different contexts. We are losing sort of the community hubs and the community spaces that we all enjoy and get to be able to relate to each other and learn from each other. So the fact that farm stops maintain that means that there's more cohesion and more of a sense of community that people want to contribute to and hang on to. So that further enhances the resilience of that space. As a quick little quote here, one survey respondent from Random Harvest mentioned how present Random Harvest was during the pandemic and how safe they felt during a period where they felt they couldn't go shopping elsewhere. And that right there is also a value that we don't often see in larger scale operations or supermarkets. People feel that they have a personal connection to that place itself. So again, touching on that diversified revenue, it really enhances the flexibility of these stores to crisis events. I mean, that diversified revenue streams, that we've heard it mentioned multiple times today. It could be a tavern, a cafe, it could be incubator kitchen spaces or other incubator spaces for local businesses. They could be online stores, CSAs, classes, activities. There's no end to the creativity that a farm stop can employ in terms of how they can interact with their farmers and their community. Of course, budget depending and resources depending, but the fact that this is a crucial element of maintaining the model itself means that it has a much stronger foothold within the community and really enhances that sense of place. So again, talking about the community here, one of the other reasons why it enhances just this community, the sense of place, is because people felt that it not only provides this unique shopping experience where people can get everything that they need and also kind of hang out with their families or their kids, their dogs, and enjoy a show, a cup of coffee, a class, maybe whatever else is offered at the time, but it's an inclusive space. It's a welcoming space, one that is staffed with people who are typically more passionate and more supportive of the mission that the farm stops employ. And that rubs off on the people who are shopping there. It's important to consumers, according to the research that I found here, that they can engage with people who care about the work, who care about the mission, and then can impart that. I feel like in most other retail spaces, it's not often that you can walk up to someone who works there and they can tell you exactly, what kind of farmer came in the morning, what kind of products they set out, and, what kind of person they are, and kind of steer you in the right direction of actually talking to a farmer themselves. So the fact that people were able to engage in another way of connecting with the store itself meant that people really value these places and want to continue to see them thrive. So essentially, it just brings people together. It provides a space for people to not just shop for groceries, but also to engage with their community, which, as I mentioned, is incredibly important. I mean, I've seen articles in places, again, I'm not throwing California under the bus here, but I know there's a couple places in California right now that coffee shops that have become completely automated, or they're using AI systems where they get rid of a counter, they get rid of the people working there, they get rid of all of the tables, and you have like a little tablet that you put your order in, and a little mechanical arm gives you your coffee, and then you go about your day. This kind of thing is unfortunately a bit more pervasive, and it removes us further from the relationships that we're able to make with each other and the bonds that we're able to create in the place that we're in. This is the sort of thing that allows us to look at a place like Ann Arbor or Wooster or Huntington and say, I love living here because I have this community here. So again, that sense of place, it's a social glue that keeps us together. And this is something that we need to continue fostering. We need, as we just talked about in that panel discussion, we need collaboration. We need to be able to rely on each other, and farm stops are able to foster that sense of place for people. Lastly, this is the advocacy piece that I mentioned earlier, that 95% of people felt that they are directly contributing to the growth of a local food system. The reason that I feel like this is so incredibly important is because essentially it replicates a level of behavior change that we are trying to work with in so many different aspects or elements of the food system. So because these farm stops offered a wide variety of goods and allowed people to participate, shopping in an inclusive and welcoming environment, because it created the sense of community, it creates also the sense of meaningful action. The fact that many people felt that they personally were directly contributing to the development of a local and regional food system meant that these stores, farm stops, simply by existing, are giving people agency within their own communities. They're educating people about the importance of local food, about connecting with local growers, and they're making people feel confident in their choices that not just help themselves, but also help their community. And this is essentially called meaningful action, which is basically just the desire to feel needed and to make a difference. I mean, this is something we all experience regularly. And so a farm stop, simply by existing, helps to foster the sense of meaningful action, which means that people are going to be more confident about supporting that place. They're going to prioritize shopping there because it gives them much more than just their food provisioning or just their groceries. So to me, my background, my master's is in behavioral psychology. I'm a total geek for this. So this, to me, represents a fairly effortless shift in changing people's perspectives and their priorities towards supporting a local and regional food system. It often, I know, feels like a drop in the bucket at a time, but this is it. Just by having these stores here and available, people are able to shift their patterns and their habits. So basically the key takeaways, because I want to give Matt some time here too. So essentially, farm stops are keeping local money circulating, enhancing the financial resilience of that place. They are enhancing the cultural resilience of communities by acting as this social glue, which further protects us against, pandemics, recessions, any other sort of supply chain disruptions. They enhance the sense of place by drawing people in, allowing them to feel welcomed and confident in their choices. And they're also allowing people to shift their priorities towards supporting the development of a local and regional food system, making it easier, potentially, for these farm stops to flourish. Of course, more research is needed for that. But the second portion of my project was essentially creating a guidebook on how to replicate these models. So it is available online as a free, downloadable, open access document. So I hope that QR code works. Maybe if someone tries it, just let me know. But we also do have them for sale on that table as well if you want a physical copy. Essentially, this book, I worked directly with the owners, operators of most of the farm stops who participated in this project to understand as many nitty-gritty details of this model as possible, because it takes a village, truly, to make something like this happen. And it takes a lot of resources and a lot of elbow grease, time, and effort. So hopefully this book has the majority of the resources that you need, but if anyone does read it or have an interest in it and find something's missing, please let me know. I am always open to anyone emailing me directly, letting me know about any other additions or other feedback to that model as it arises, because even in the 2 years since I wrote this book, there's still a lot of things that have changed. So I'm very grateful to be here today with you all. I thank you all so much for your time and for being here and supporting the amazing work that these groups are doing. I'm going to hand it off now to Matt Mariola to talk about his research with local roots. But thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone. I think the idea here is I'm going to present my piece and then we'll take questions together. Not super legible there. I should have known. Orange, not a great color. My day job is a professor of environmental studies at the College of Wooster, a small liberal arts college in Ohio that just also happens to be the home of Local Roots. And in my spare time, I'm the president of FoodSphere. You may have seen the presentation earlier about FoodSphere. The connection between my presentation and Katie's is basically this. If we believe, and we now have evidence, that these farm stops have this community impact, and that's driven by supply and sales, well, sales and supply are driven by demand. And so if we want success, we should know what that demand looks like. I happened to have a research sabbatical during the pandemic. I couldn't travel. I couldn't do the kinds of research I normally do. So I thought, well, Local Roots just passed its 10-year anniversary. So this is a really interesting moment to look at 10 years of Local Roots sales data and figure out, as I say here, what do local food consumers want? And so we decided to do a deep dive into the data to see if there are interesting patterns that other farm stops and local foods markets could take advantage of. I have to give you the same warning. As an academic, you always strive for precision. Old data alert. I conducted this study in 2021 using data up through 2020, so it's a little out of date now. What I'm telling you here is we're going to lean into that and embrace the age of the data because it leads to some interesting questions about what next research steps there are. And I'd love to get your feedback on that. So that'll be my last slide. At this point, I don't even know if you need this map, but Local Roots is right there in northeastern Ohio. And just to remind you what Adam told you all this morning, it's been around for about 14 years. It has variable commission rates. We're now up to 18, I say we. I've been closely affiliated with Local Roots, but I don't work for Local Roots. They now have 18 paid staff, and they have a monthly meeting of the board of directors. And again, the idea here was we have 10 years of sales data. That's a lot of sales data. Can we parse it for some interesting patterns as to the kinds of decisions that local foods consumers make? All right, so the methodology, I got to give a shout out to Adam, executive director of Local Roots, because we worked together very closely as a partnership on this project, and we had to procure 10 years of sales data, and he was instrumental in helping me do that. So basically downloaded 10 years of sales data starting January 1, 2011, all the way through the end of 2020, and ended up being about 1.1 million data points. By data point here, I mean individual items that were sold. If you bring a bag of apples and you buy it, that's a data point. If you bring a cinnamon bun, that's a data point. Now this is food only. We didn't look at artisan goods or artists' goods, just food items. And the first step was we needed to categorize all the foods into these 8 categories. We used a categorization scheme that the USDA has developed and modified it slightly. But basically, we wanted to be able to look at these categories because that's where the interesting patterns emerge from. I'll give you a moment just to take those in because this ends up being quite important. All right, so let's dive into the data here. So first we'll look at sales data. This is overall gross food sales. Again, Adam showed a very similar slide that actually went all the way up to 2023. I like to show this slide to show that there were kind of 3 phases during the first 10 years of Local Roots. You had an initial growth phase where it grew fairly rapidly given how small and shoestring of an organization it was. Then there was a period of plateauing. And then beginning in 2018, which Adam's a humble guy, but I'll say, when did Adam start as executive director? 2018. So there's probably a correlation, maybe even causation. Anyway, and from 2018 through 2020, you had a period of tremendous growth of sales. So that's some interesting context for the sales data. So let's start off by looking at those food categories. And one thing I was curious about is what is the difference between, as I call it here, the volume to revenue relationship. So the left 2 columns is, you see here the number of total produce items sold. So again, that could be a bag of carrots, a head of lettuce. However the SKU was for a given produce item, 322,432 individual produce beeps at the counter. And as you can see, that accounted for 29% of all items sold. And you can go down through the other ones as well. But if we look at actual revenue generation, you can see that the 29% of all items sold, accounted for by produce, only generated 18% of revenue. Okay, so you have a differential between the volume of sales and the revenue. Now, of course, this doesn't mean sell less produce because it makes you less money, but it's just an interesting fact. If you're running a market, you need to know this kind of thing. On the other hand, you had other categories which sold a smaller percent as a percent of items sold, but made a larger percent of total revenue. So if you just compare that number to that number, you can see that certain ones stand out. Meat being a really good example, almost double the percent of items sold versus the percent of sales generated. Another thing we were curious about is how did the differences between these different categories change over time? So we mapped that out. I hope the colors are legible there. Everything went up between 2018 and 2020, but some things went up at more rapid rates than others. And really the story here that stands out, as the red circle indicates, is the rapid increase in takeaway foods. Now you might think this was a COVID phenomenon, but it precedes COVID by several years. In the Q&A session, I'll let Adam speak to it more specifically. There's questions about this, but this is something that a market can have a lot of very specific control over, right? This is a decision you can make about how much takeaway food to produce in the kitchen and offer in the marketplace. But we have an interesting trend here about what drives foot traffic, what drives demand at the marketplace. The next question we asked was, are there changes that would be of interest to market managers from month to month? So basically what we looked at here was, what is the total amount of food sales in a given month, on average across the 10 years, compared to the following month? And then we basically asked, how did sales, so you can see here from the title, what you're looking at in the bar in terms of the percent is how did sales change from the previous month on average? So this averages all Augusts and compares it to all Julys, if that makes sense, okay? The error bars you see there are the range across the 10 years, and the colored bar is the average. So the things that jumped out to us here, let's look at a really obvious one and a less obvious one. The obvious one is January. Okay, in January, your sales plummet relative to December. Makes sense, because December you get all your holiday sales. And indeed, December sales are much higher than November sales. So that one wasn't a surprise. Me personally, I was surprised by the September bar. And to this day, I'm still kind of puzzled by it. why would sales overall at the market drop off in September compared to August? And I went around with this with Adam. There's a couple hypotheses we've thrown out. One is that we live in a fairly rural county. A lot of people have gardens. Maybe people are starting to harvest the bounty from their gardens in September and don't need as much from the market. Another hypothesis is that's when school starts. Parents get busy, less time to shop. There's probably other hypotheses out there as well. But that's an interesting one to bat around and consider. On the other hand, you have months where sales suddenly pick up relative to the previous month. So again, from the point of view of managing a market and managing supply and demand, these are interesting things to know. That one might just be a statistical artifact of the fact that September dropped off so much. But yeah, I'd love to parse that, and I haven't yet. We wanted to look at membership. So remember, we're a cooperative, a producer-consumer co-op. So producers are required to be members of the co-op in order to sell there. Consumers are not required to be members to shop there, but many of them are. And so we wanted to know, like, what is the impact of the memberships? You have to pay a $50 annual fee to be a member of the co-op. So first of all, just giving you a sense of over time how many paying members there were, looking at both renewals, so people who already were members and paid again to be members, versus new memberships. So here you see an interesting correlation with the rise in sales between 2018 and 2020. A lot of that is driven by just getting more members on board. A lot of new members joined in 2020. What I was really interested in as a researcher was, is there a correlation between being a member and spending more money? So we looked at this. We just took the average receipt value. So that means you go up to the counter with 4 items, you get a receipt. So we looked at the full receipt from your purchase, not item by item, but just how much did you spend in total on a given shopping trip. So we looked at that for members versus non-members, and you can see that's a very clear relationship with zero variation. Members in general, on average, spend more at the market than non-members.
What do the members get besides feeling participation and
there's discounts on certain items, in a given month. The discounts change. There's also a dividend promised, but never yet achieved. Yeah, right. So across 10, now 14 years, you have a lot of, hundreds, now thousands of paying members. No one's ever received a dividend check. So I'm glad you asked the question, because it shows a lot of this is just driven by a deep, belief in the system.
Does that include discounts? Does that include the discounts? They're still spending money?
Yes, yeah, because we took it just off the amount they actually spent. Yep. Now this too brings up a really interesting causal question. Are they spending more because they're members and they feel more vested? Or are those the people that always would have spent more anyway? Impossible to answer that question without actually asking them. So that's an additional question to ask. But I think I'll leave it. We'll speculate as an audience. I think I just have one more slide of data, I believe. So I was also interested in the question of how much are the different producers making at the market, and how does that break down by sales class? There's some interesting correlates here with farm sales, if you've ever looked into the ag census data. So basically we broke all the vendors into categories based on the amount they sold at the market. And we broke that out over the years. Now I remember Bill's slide from this morning from Argus. You had, I think, 87 farmers that were averaging over $50,000. So we're talking about a different scale of produce sales there. As you can see, the highest category we had was $20,000 and up. Now, there's more members in that category now, so this is one way in which the data are a little outdated. But I thought it was really interesting that you really have a mix here. You have a small number of very high volume sellers, and then you have a very large number of much lower volume sellers. I would say, and being a member of the co-op and a person who shops there, you need both. You don't want to say, well, let's just get more of these 13 that are selling 20,000 and up, because they're driving foot traffic and revenue. Well, actually, no. Foot traffic is being driven by the sheer bounty and the diversity of things in the market. So actually, these numbers of people who sell less things are just as important, I would argue, from a foot traffic point of view. Nevertheless, it's interesting to know how many larger volume sellers do you have, because you do want to be able to make the argument to those who wish to make a living from this that you can. So some summaries. Do I have time for this? Okay, a little tight. Let me actually maybe flip, because I think we basically said all these things already. This is just putting them all on one slide. I wanted to tick to the very last question here, which is, or the slide. I wanted to turn this out to the audience, so maybe this is a good segue to the questions. So that was from 2020, and now we have more farm stops with more data. Argus just passed its 10-year anniversary, so maybe we could do an interesting comparison. So my thoughts to you all are, I'd like to know as a researcher, like, what's missing here? What other questions could we be asking? What's interesting? What's not so interesting? So maybe on that note, I'll stop, and Katie and I can both entertain questions. Thank you.
Can you put the slide back up with all the takeaways?
Oh, sure thing. Good idea. Yes.
The slide for the different amounts of money each farm makes. What do you have data about who's moving across those lines? Oh, sorry. Do you have data about who's moving across those lines and who's moving up and who's moving down at all? Because I think that'd be really interesting. What is the upward mobility for each of these farms?
Great
at
question.
A farm stop?
Yeah, short answer is I don't. I didn't do that level of analysis, but that would be a great question to ask. Bear in mind too, this is both makers of cafe foods and takeaway foods and farmers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Producers, yeah.
Yeah. All producers. Yeah.
Just be curious to know what your member, like your co-op membership retention rate is year to year.
Membership retention rate. I suppose you could kind of.
I mean, I see that it goes up, but I'm curious how many of those are was also a member last year.
Right.
Oh, I see that. Okay.
Yeah. So your orange is renewals, right? Maybe have to do a tiny bit of calculation to figure out the actual rates, but yeah. This would be a good example of why we need, I need to update the data so we can look at what happened to those 300 new members that came on in 2020. Yeah.
Hi, back to your question about what, what additional things you'd like to look at. I'd be curious, we're a program that supports shoppers that use food assistance benefits to be able to access farm stops and CSAs and that type of thing. I'd be curious to know, how accessible these farm stop models are for, shoppers that, again, use food assistance benefits.
Okay, did you want to take that one about accessibility? And I have maybe a more limited purview on that here.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. I think that we've touched on this a little bit today. The beauty of the farm stop model, in my opinion, and maybe, I don't know, Adam or anyone else here who operates one, is that it works really well with a number of different opportunities to support lower cost purchasing as well. So most farm stops can work with SNAP and EBT benefits. I know in Michigan they use the double up food bucks. I know Argus has a sliding scale or a discounted CSA box as well. So there are, and some of them also offer mobile markets or collaborations with mobile markets. There are plenty of donation efforts. So the beauty of the model itself is that is absolutely available and accessible within the market as well. So it with the model, I can appreciate that sometimes you look at a place like Ann Arbor where you're like, well, this place is a little bit more well off. It's definitely a little wealthier, but there's a lot of ways that a farm stop can support food access itself, and I think that's growing, and I think there's a lot of creative ways to do that. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, or Adam, if you do as well. Throwing you on the spot.
I can drop a pessimistic note. That's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for everybody, and I don't want to over-explain, but I can give you one recent example is that we just launched a program through an organization called Produce Perks, which is based out of Cincinnati. They're a nonprofit that services the Ohio state area, and they offer a coupon booklet where it's $140 of free produce and $5 coupons to anybody that's eligible, 200% of the poverty level and below, and a federal poverty level and below, and a child in the household will get you $140 of free produce. You can get it twice a year. Sounds great, right? So we signed up for this program. We're really excited about it. We put it in our newsletter. We put it on Facebook. We put it on Instagram. I spoke with the program manager. We just launched it last week. She came into the store and she said, don't worry. I know you're worried that this place is expensive, and because we try to do things environmentally sustainable, you add up the farmer's cost to be able to do this. We need to be able to offer them a fair price. They set their own prices, just bundling this whole thing for you to understand. If you're going to do it local, you're going to do it environmentally sustainable, and you're going to offer people a fair wage, it's not going to be cheap, right? So when you look at the access for people that want to purchase and they're on a budget, even if they are on a SNAP eligible program, their dollars go much farther in terms of calories and terms of, overall health is an argument. But if you're on a budget and you need to be able to feed your kids that week, you're not going to Local Roots and buying a basket of goods. She said, don't worry, you won't do that bad. One program I went to, we did a launch. I was there for 4 hours. We only had 8 people sign up. She was there for 4 hours. We didn't have a single person sign up. That's not a bad thing necessarily. That's an opportunity for improvement. All of that to say, we had 3 people sign up last week. We're going to keep trying to push it. But to the question, maybe it was a comment that you were making, but to the question you were asking is accessibility for low-income individuals to be able to eat and regularly access healthy foods is an uphill battle that we continuously fight.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing to that as well. In writing the guidebook, one thing that I did hear from a lot of farm stops as well, even though the SNAP EBT benefits were often available, incorporating that into the point of sale system became another barrier sometimes that even though it was, available to them, accessible, it wasn't always the easiest thing to implement. So just to, Adam's point there, it's, I think, a work in progress, but I think it's possible for sure. Yeah.
I'm always interested in the transportation burden, especially on the smaller producers. I'm just wondering, I would love to know mileage traveled and any kind of collaborative travel and just delivery that was going on.
Yeah, I don't have any data on that myself. I'm a data hole when it comes to that one. That's something we could look at, although I don't know that we necessarily, I don't know if the database of info that I have would necessarily have home addresses and be able to track it, but it wouldn't be that hard to come by. But yeah, I could only speak to it anecdotally, and I don't really want to answer it anecdotally.
Since I have the mic anyway, for future research, I'm interested in how farm stops change farmer behavior and their business practices, and having a bunch of farmers all kind of crammed together. I've always imagined farmers maybe are like, well, there's so many people selling this, I'm now going to shift my production to this, or I'm going to add a high tunnel so that I can get into this winter market that exists now. Those are the kinds of things I've been interested in for data wise.
Stay tuned. I have a bunch of that coming up.
Maybe you can give me a preview.
Sure. Happy to. I think we could take one more, and then I think the other session's about to start.
Katie, you paint a pretty rosy picture with your survey results and the farm stop model. Were there results from the survey that wasn't so rosy, that was a little negative or unexpected?
It's a good question. Definitely that is a rose-colored glasses perspective. There's a lot of realities, as Adam has shown, as other individuals who own and operate a farm stop have shown. It's not always that easy. In terms of any particular outstanding negative sort of perspectives, I think the access piece in terms of accessibility for lower income was definitely something that stood out, and I think it's still a question that is being worked on for sure. But like I said, that was a very small sample size. And one other thing, too, that I came across was whether or not that sample size represented individuals who already had the value of prioritizing a local food system versus those who had shifted and wanted to actually change their purchasing habits. So even though it did represent a good pool of people who were willing and able to, and very gung-ho about prioritizing a place like Farm Stop, I can't say for sure if that was representing a general shift in the population's view or perspective of supporting a place like a Farm Stop. I don't know for sure if it was just existing values or new values that came up. So it's a great question, and definitely one that we could work on. I think we're out of time. Oh, we're moving into a break. So if anyone does have additional questions, I'm happy to hang around and chat for a minute. I don't know if you are too, but I'll be up here. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all. I will say real quick, this study is available. It's a open access journal, so it's available to anyone on the internet. It's foodsystemsjournal.org. You can find it there, foodsystemsjournal.org.